first thing to consider when working out whether a defendant can use the defence of consent is what exactly can someone consent to? What can the victim consent to? And the most important thing to know is that consent can never be a defence to murder or assisted suicide. So if someone asks the defendant to aid them in taking their own life, and the defendant supplied them with drugs or took them somewhere where the person could potentially take their own life, it would be no defence to say that the victim had consented. The general rule is that the victim can only consent to minor harm, and here we're talking about battery and the application potentially of force to another person. And that's because on a daily basis, we all give consent to situations where force is applied to us, and other people around us give consent to us applying force to them. This might be a handshake, hugs, kisses, slaps on the back, or even sexual contact. All of this is consensual. And of course, we all give consent to the jostlings of everyday life to a certain extent, like pressing up against people at a festival, or bumping into people on the tube, or giving people a hug, or while walking along the pavement. So the general rule is that consent is only a defence to minor harm unless it comes under one of the exceptions. So let's have a look at those exceptions. The first of the exceptions to the general rule concerns medical procedures. We can give consent to really serious harm that doctors sometimes have to inflict upon us to get inside us, or to break a leg in order to reset. And of course, the defendant or the doctor will not be charged with a criminal offence, unless, of course, as happened a few years ago, a doctor was carrying out surgery that wasn't required. For some inexplicable reason, he diagnosed dozens of women with breast cancer and went on to operate on them, even though they didn't actually require the operation. He got consent from them, but because it wasn't required, the consent wasn't real, and he couldn't use the defence and got a long prison sentence for the physical injuries that he'd inflicted on these women. The second exception to the general rule is that of body adornments, things like tattoos and piercings. They involve the cutting of a number of layers of skin, and getting inked is quite messy, but a person can give consent to tattooing an ear and body piercing as long as they are old enough. It ought to be pointed out that some types of body modifications do not come under body adornment, the exception to tattoos and piercing. Some tattoo artists in recent years have carried out procedures like tongue splitting, nipple removal, and ear pointing. And the Court of Appeal said in a quite recent case that these types of procedures, in order to give consent to them, the person carrying them out must be a qualified doctor. And so people who do carry out these procedures and aren't qualified doctors can potentially be charged with GBH, and the defence of consent will not be a defence for them. The third exception to the rule is that involving properly conducted contact sports. Now, this is called implied consent to possible injury. In other words, we take part knowing that there is a risk involved, but we'll go ahead and are prepared to take that risk. The problem comes with when a person is potentially fouled and injured, or injured in some way outside the rules of the game. And the courts look very closely at these types of cases where the defendant is claiming consent, and they will often look at the type of sport being played and how much physical violence is normally involved in it. And ice hockey is quite a good example here, because there is a lot of violence in ice hockey that's acceptable and almost part of the rules. And so someone who was injured in an attack during ice hockey, or they were squashed up against the side, the defendant might well be able to use consent. But if the same sort of injury happened in a sport like football, then probably not. The courts will also look at the level at which it is played, the degree of force used, whether it was an off-the-ball incident, and how serious the risk of injury was, to work out whether the victim had really consented to the risk of that type of thing happening. The fourth exception to the general rule involves horseplay or play fighting. Now, young children or teenagers or even young adults will often sort of engage in rough and undisciplined play, and this is often termed horseplay. And the general rule is that you can consent to the risk of ABH or GBH if you take part in those types of activities. So if as a defendant you injured someone while play fighting, then you could claim that the victim had consented to taking part and so had consented to the risk involved with that type of activity. And so it is an exception to the general rule that you can only consent to minor harm. The law on consent does, of course, allow people to engage in what might sometimes be quite rough and passionate sexual activity. And as long as there is consent from all the parties involved and no actual bodily or grievous bodily harm occurs, the criminal law usually doesn't get involved. But if, however, there is intention on the part of somebody involved in that activity to cause ABH or GBH, then the law of consent will fail. Or if there's a significant high risk of serious harm occurring because of that sexual activity, then once again, the law of consent will not be available as a defence.